AM 950, the progressive voice of Minnesota. Bret Johnson with you here on a Tuesday afternoon. And as usual on Tuesdays, we are joined by the editor-in-chief of the Minnesota Reformer. That's Patrick Coolican. Make sure you go to minnesotareformer.com for the best in Minnesota news and politics and in-depth reporting. As today, we are going to be previewing the vice presidential debate. Plus, we'll be talking about a column that Patrick wrote that talks about, late-term abortions and some misleading statements by the Trump campaign over the past few months. Plus, we'll be talking about lobbyist numbers in the Minnesota State Legislature, and those numbers have gone up significantly since the last session in terms of the amount of money that has been spent on lobbying. So lots to get to today. Patrick, thanks so much for coming back on the show.
Always a pleasure.
Absolutely. So let's start off talking about lobbying, because back in 2023, Minnesota's legislative session saw an historic surge in lobbying efforts, with corporations, labor unions, and advocacy organizations spending almost $100 million to try to influence lawmakers. In fact, a new report shows that this 18% increase in spending was driven by the fact that DFL obviously had a trifecta, and they passed a lot of progressive policies such as paid family leave, universal school meals, and free college tuition. So what I'm curious about when it comes to talking about this increase in spending, when it comes to lobbying, were these all generally from progressive groups, or were some of this spending kind of in opposition to progressive policies? I'm kind of curious how the gamut kind of ran on this increase in lobbyist spending.
No, we had plenty of spending on the corporate side, and that makes sense because they were really playing a lot of defense. So they were spending a lot of money trying to persuade lawmakers to slow down a bit on those progressive policies. The evidence wouldn't show that it was money particularly well spent, although perhaps I think the Minnesota Chamber of Commerce has told its members that it could have been a lot worse for them, especially on the paid leave law that was passed in 2023 and takes effect in 2026. But certainly some big spending on the progressive side. There were a lot of nonprofits that were trying to get their hands on some of that surplus money, the $17 billion surplus. The teachers union, after really delivering in the election of 2022, turned around and certainly played a big role trying to influence legislation and generally had a very good session. So it was, I would say there was parity between progressive groups and labor unions and some of the big business groups and businesses. Certainly Xcel Energy, traditionally always a big spender on lobbying, especially at the Public Utilities Commission. That makes sense, but then also at the legislature. If you remember, the 2040 carbon-free energy mandate, electricity mandate, was legislated, and Xcel will have a big role in that policy. So, it was a huge year. And other thing to keep in mind is that coming out of the pandemic, this was really, 2023 was the first sort of regular legislative session where there was much more face-to-face contact around the Capitol. And so that explains some of the increase. And then, of course, there was also inflation in 2021 and 22 that could explain some of it. But when all is said and done, I joked with our reporter, Michelle Griffith, that there's probably some lake houses and some boats that were paid for by that 2023 session.
Well, you can read more about those numbers over at minnesotareformer.com, including how the definition of a lobbyist changed over the past few years, which may have also led to that increase in spending. Again, find more details about that over at minnesotareformer.com. Want to move on now to a column that you wrote in this week's Reformer, in fact, today, which basically has to do with misleading statements by Trump and Vance when it comes to abortion. Because in a powerful and very emotional story, Brooklyn Park mom Tippi Amundsen shared her experience back in 2016 with a medically necessary abortion after receiving heartbreaking news about her pregnancy. Her story highlights the stigma surrounding later-term abortions, the dangerous political rhetoric from figures like Donald Trump, and really the importance of access to safe reproductive care. Tippy was born to a religious anti-abortion family, and the last thing she could have imagined is becoming an abortion's rights advocate. But as with so many people, life ends up happening. So, Patrick, as you had a chance to talk to Tippy, tell us a little bit about her story and what she went through back in 2016, because this is something that often gets kind of forgotten about when we talk about later term abortions, when they're so often highlighted by Trump and Vance using very right wing and inflammatory rhetoric. So, tell us about what she went through back in 2016.
Yeah, so she and her husband had planned this pregnancy. It was their first baby. They wanted to have a family. And everything was going along. And then they get this terrible news at around 20 weeks, which is that their baby did not have a secure attachment to her placenta, which means he was not getting nutrients, and he'd stopped developing between 12 and 15 weeks. So there was really no chance of survival, even though he still had a heartbeat. But certainly the worst kind of news you can hear as a pregnant person. And then the news was actually worse because the placenta was growing into her uterus. And so the doctor said, well, if you don't move quickly here, we may have to remove her uterus. And that would, of course, prevent her from carrying babies in the future. And at 20 weeks, this is pre-Dobbs, so even with the protections of Roe v. Wade at the time, and also our own version of Roe v. Wade called Doe v. Gomez here in Minnesota, it was hard for her to find a place where that would do the procedure that late in the pregnancy, and she wound up at Planned Parenthood. She now has 3 children. The part of what has been so difficult and traumatic is that when Republicans, and especially Donald Trump, talk about these kinds of abortions, they really they act as if it's infanticide, and as if people are just having these elective abortions. Including, he made the claim in the debate, recent debate earlier this month, that essentially that murder after the child is born is legal in Minnesota. That's obviously not true. It's not true anywhere. And it really demeans her experience, and so it's painful for her and so many mothers like her to have to go through these political campaigns when you have people who don't understand, apparently, or choose to lie about the complications of pregnancy, making these comments. And so she's activated and trying to get her story and the stories of mothers like her out to the country, so that we can make good choices about reproductive health policy.
And I think, as you point out in your newsletter, we do need to do a better job really teaching people, and I think primarily men, about all the complications that can result with pregnancy and the birthing process. Because I think as you look at someone like Trump and Vance, they're either misleading because they don't know, or they're flat out lying. But overall, I think a lot of people just don't overall know about all the complications that can happen with pregnancy and birth.
Yeah, and I think there's a problem with lack of comprehensive sex education, and that's certainly lacking in the United States as well. And that's almost it became something that I really figured out as I was reporting and writing this piece. I was like, wow, these people just don't really have any idea. And I think that for so long, the abortion rights movement was back on its heels and was kind of playing defense. And now I think it's time to turn that around and help educate people about, some of what can go on after the first trimester, and why it's important to keep abortion rights throughout the pregnancy.
I also want to ask you about this because there's this important distinction when it comes to some words in Minnesota law, because the distinction between the words preserve and care in Minnesota's abortion laws is really a focal point for the anti-abortion movement. Can you explain why this change occurred in Minnesota law and really why anti-abortion activists have really latched onto this when it comes to pushing a lot of their inflammatory rhetoric when it comes to abortion?
Yeah. So the statute used to say that a born alive infant, as a result of an abortion, shall be fully recognized as a human person, and reasonable measures consistent with good medical practice shall be taken by responsible medical personnel to preserve the life and health of the born alive infant. The language was changed to say that an infant who is born alive shall be fully recognized as a human person, and accorded immediate protection under the law, and that responsible medical personnel should care for the infant who is born alive. And so there was a slight word change in 2023, and the anti-abortion advocates say that it precluded or it prevented us from forcing medical personnel to save the life of a child, when in fact all it did was prevent a reading of the law, which could require extraordinary measures that might temporarily preserve the child's life, but exacerbating his suffering before his inevitable death. So the reason they changed that was because it gave legal protection in these cases where the child is going to expire, and what you don't want is to have medical personnel taking extraordinary measures that are just going to prolong suffering. And also, to be clear, the statute still says that the infant who is born alive shall be fully recognized as a human person. So that does not mean that murder is somehow legal now because of the statute change. All it did was make very clear that doctors do not have to go to extraordinary lengths to keep a child alive when you would just be exacerbating his suffering before he inevitably dies.
Which is important to point out because we're likely to hear that sort of rhetoric tonight when J.D. Vance takes on Tim Walz. I'd be very surprised if he doesn't mention that during the debate, but still an important distinction to bring up when it comes to what that wording actually means and that change in Minnesota law. Make sure you go and read Patrick's column talking about Tippi Amundsen and what she experienced back in 2016, because it does give you a new perspective on, well, what some of these right-wingers are talking about when they mention late-term abortions and how it's a much more complicated issue than they make it out to be. Find that over at minnesotareformer.com. We have been speaking with Patrick Coolican, who is the editor-in-chief of the Minnesota Reformer. Again, minnesotareformer.com. Patrick, as always, thanks for coming on the show today.
Always a pleasure. Thanks.
All right, let's take a break and send things back over to Matt McNeil on AM 950.